What's a woman's honor worth in the West? To some it's a prize to be won. For Jackson Blackwood, a man of staggering wealth and Comanche blood, it was the stake in a $5,000 bet. The prize, a night with the untouchable widow, Seraphina Hayes. He wagered his fortune and his pride that his charm could melt her icy resolve. He was arrogant, relentless, and he won. But as the prairie moon stood witness in the silence of her bedroom, the widow didn't offer him victory. She offered him a truth, a secret whispered in the dark that would shatter his world, redefine his past, and make the most powerful man in the territory freeze in his tracks. This isn't just a story of a bet. It's the story of a reckoning that fire and blood couldn't erase. The air in the Redemption Gulch Grand Saloon was a thick stew of cheap whiskey, stale cigar smoke, and the low murmur of desperate men. It was a place where fortunes were lost on the turn of a card, and reputations were shattered with a single misplaced word. At the center of this den of vice-holding court, at a heavy oak table, sat Jackson Jax Blackwood. He was a man carved from the contradictions of the land itself, skin the color of rich earth from his Comanche mother eyes, a startling, piercing blue from his white father. His wealth was a living legend, a sprawling cattle empire that choked the horizon, and he wore it not with quiet dignity, but like a suit of gleaming, impenetrable armor. Across from him, Sterling Cartwright sneered his florid face, a testament to a life of excess and inherited privilege. Cartwright owned the second-largest spread in the territory, and the fact that a half-breed, as he so often spat, owned the first was a constant burning ulcer in his gut. "Another round for Mr. Blackwood." Sterling called out, his voice dripping with mock deference. "He seems to be buying up all the luck tonight, same as he buys up everything else." Jax didn't look up from his poker hand. He simply fanned the cards, 3 kings and 2 aces, and slid a heavy stack of gold coins into the center of the table. "Luck follows ambition, Cartwright. You should try acquiring some." The men around the table chuckled nervously. To cross Sterling Cartwright was foolish. To cross Jax Blackwood was suicidal. Cartwright's face purpled. He slammed his empty glass down. "There are some things your money can't buy, Blackwood. Some things that require breeding, decency, a pure bloodline." Jax finally met his gaze, his blue eyes cold as a winter river. "And what might those be?" "Honor," Sterling sneered. "Respectability. A woman like the widow Hayes." A hush fell over the saloon. Seraphina Hayes was a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and pity. The widow of the late formidable rancher, Elias Hayes, she lived a life of self-imposed exile on his pristine ranch, the last serenity. She was beautiful, proud, and utterly unapproachable. Since Elias's death from a supposed riding accident a year prior, she had rebuffed every suitor, rejected every offer to buy her land, and turned away every well-meaning neighbor with a polite but unbreakable firmness. She was a fortress, and in the minds of men like Cartwright, the ultimate unattainable prize. "Mrs. Hayes," Jax corrected him, his voice dangerously soft. "She's earned that respect." "Respect," Cartwright laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's a woman alone on a prime piece of land. She's a prize waiting to be claimed. But not by the likes of you. She'd never let a man with your blood touch her." The insult hung in the air, thick and venomous. Jax's hand, which had been resting on his cards, slowly clenched into a fist. Every man in the room could feel the temperature drop. Gus Jax's grizzled foreman, who always stood watch from a corner table, subtly shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. But Jax didn't reach for his gun. He smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips that held no warmth at all. It was the smile of a man who fought with weapons far sharper than lead. "Is that a challenge, Sterling?" Jax asked, his voice a low drawl. Cartwright, emboldened by whiskey and a lifetime of unearned confidence, saw his opening. This was his chance to humiliate the man he despised. "It's a statement of fact," he blustered. "But if you want to make it interesting, I'll wager $5,000 in gold coin that you can't even get her to invite you in for a cup of coffee." The amount was staggering. It was enough to buy a small ranch, to fund a cattle drive to Kansas, to change a man's life forever. The saloon, already quiet, became deathly still. Jax leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He steepled his fingers, his cold blue eyes fixed on Cartwright. He saw the trap. This wasn't about coffee. It was about public humiliation. If he failed, Cartwright would own the story painting him as the savage who was rejected by the civilized white widow. If he refused the bet, he'd be branded a coward. $5,000 is a fine start," Jack said calmly, his gaze sweeping over the rapt faces in the room. "But the terms are too simple. Let's make it a real test of a man's persuasive abilities." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that every man strained to hear. "I wager $5,000 that within 1 month, Serafina Hayes will not only invite me into her home, she will invite me into her bed. Willingly." A collective gasp went through the room. This was no longer about pride. It was a brazen assault on a woman's virtue, a public declaration of conquest. It was cruel, arrogant, and utterly shocking. Sterling Cartwright's eyes lit up with malicious glee. This was better than he could have imagined. Blackwood had just handed him the rope to hang himself. "Willingly," he echoed, savoring the word. "You'll have to prove it. A sworn statement from the lady herself, perhaps." Jax shook his head. "No, nothing so crude. We'll need a witness to the invitation. And as for the rest, a gentleman doesn't kiss and tell." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "But if she allows me to stay the night, from dusk until dawn, witnessed by one of your men and one of mine, watching the house from a distance, the bet is won." It was a cold, calculated and deeply dishonorable proposal. But in the smoke-filled moral vacuum of the Redemption Gulch Grand Saloon, it was seen as the stuff of legend. Cartwright stuck out his hand, his piggish eyes gleaming. "You have a bet, Blackwood. Prepare to be $5,000 poorer and the laughing stock of this territory." Jax took his hand, the grip firm and final. "And you prepare to pay for your education, Sterling. The lesson being never bet against a man who has nothing to lose and everything to prove." As Jax stood and tossed a gold eagle onto the table to cover the drinks, he felt a familiar cold fire ignite in his belly. It was the same fire that had driven him from a dispossessed boy to a cattle king. He saw Serafina Hayes not as a person, but as a territory to be conquered, a summit to be scaled. He would win this bet not just for the money or the bragging rights, but to grind Sterling Cartwright's face into the dust of his own prejudice. He strode out of the saloon into the cool night air, Gus falling into step beside him. He was completely unaware that in wagering on the widow's bed, he had just placed a bet on his own soul, and the price of winning would be 1,000 times greater than the purse. The secret she held was a ghost from a past he didn't even know he had, and it was waiting for him at the Last Serenity. The Last Serenity Ranch was aptly named. It was nestled in a wide, verdant valley, cradled by gentle rolling hills that blunted the harsh prairie winds. A crystal-clear creek lined with cottonwoods snaked through the property, a ribbon of life in the vast, sun-baked landscape. The house itself was not a sprawling mansion, but a masterpiece of sturdy, elegant design, a 2-story structure of dark timber and river stone, with a wide porch that seemed to invite quiet contemplation. It was a picture of peace, but for Jacques Blackwood, it was a fortress, and its chatelaine was the most formidable opponent he had ever faced. His first overture was a display of raw power and wealth. He sent a dozen of his finest horses, sleek, powerful beasts, with coats like polished obsidian to her ranch, as a gift. The offering was led by Gus, who was instructed to deliver a simple handwritten note from Jacques, a gift for a woman of rare spirit. May they serve you as well as you command this land. Gus returned 3 hours later, leading all 12 horses. He found Jacques on the porch of his own opulent ranch house, smoking a cigarillo. She said, and I quote, Gus began spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Mr. Blackwood's wealth is as vast as his presumption. I have my own horses. Please return these to his corral where they might be appreciated by someone impressed by such empty gestures. Jacques took a slow drag from his cigarillo, the blue smoke curling around his head. He wasn't angered. He was intrigued. A lesser woman would have been flattered or intimidated. Seraphina Hayes was neither. Score 1 for the widow. His second attempt was more subtle, learning from the town gossip that her late husband Elias had been a connoisseur of French wine. Jacques had a case of the finest Bordeaux imported at tremendous expense from St. Louis, delivered to her doorstep. The note this time was more refined. In memory of a man of taste. May this bring some small comfort. The case was returned the next day, unopened. Attached was a simple crisp card bearing her elegant script. I am not in need of comfort, Mr. Blackwood. I am in need of solitude. The town of Redemption Gulch was buzzing. Cartwright and his cronies were laughing openly in the saloon, recounting Jax's failed attempts with relish. Jax's reputation as a man who got what he wanted was taking a public beating. The pressure mounted. He decided on a direct approach. Dressed in his finest tailored suit, riding his magnificent black stallion Apollo, he rode to the last serenity himself. He found her not on the porch as he'd expected, but out in a paddock working with a young, spirited filly. She moved with a fluid grace that belied her strength. Dressed in practical buckskin trousers and a simple linen shirt, her dark auburn hair tied back in a simple braid, she was even more striking than he remembered from their few brief public encounters. There was a profound stillness about her, a self-possession that seemed to emanate from her very core. She wasn't playing the part of a grieving widow. She was simply a woman in command of her world. She saw him approach, but didn't stop her work, continuing to soothe the nervous filly with a low, calm voice. Only when he was at the fence did she turn her attention to him. Her eyes, a deep shade of hazel, held no welcome. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice even and cool. To what do I owe this intrusion? I came to apologize. Mrs. Hayes, Jax said, dismounting and leaning against the fence. He tipped his hat, employing the smooth charm that had served him so well in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. My gifts were clumsy. I meant no offense. You meant to impress, she corrected him without heat. Or perhaps to purchase. I am not for sale, Mr. Blackwood. Neither is my land, my time, or my attention. Her directness was like a splash of cold water. He was used to women who simpered, who flattered, who were awed by his presence and his power. Seraphina looked at him as if he were a mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant insect. My reputation precedes me, I see, he said with a wry smile. A reputation is the story others tell about you, she replied, turning back to the filly and stroking its neck. A character is the story you tell about yourself. I have found it wise to pay more attention to the latter. Your actions suggest your story as one of acquisition. He watched her fascinated. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't insulted him directly, yet he felt as though he'd been expertly dissected and dismissed. Every instinct screamed at him to assert his dominance, to remind her who he was. But he knew with a certainty that surprised him that such a tactic would be disastrous. This was a different kind of battle. "And what is your story, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his voice softer now. She finally turned to face him fully, her hazel eyes meeting his. "My story is my own. It is not a book to be opened by any curious stranger who happens to ride by." With that, she gave the filly a final pat and began walking toward the house, her posture erect, her stride confident. She did not look back. Jax stood at the fence for a long time, the dust settling around him. He had faced down rustlers, out-negotiated cattle barons, and stared into the barrels of guns without flinching. But in the quiet, sunlit paddock of the last serenity, he had been utterly and completely disarmed by a woman's calm refusal to be impressed. The fortress was not just unbreachable, its walls were invisible. They were built not of stone and timber, but of something far stronger, a will of iron and a spirit that answered to no one. Riding back to his ranch, the jeers he would face in town seemed insignificant. The $5,000 was a pittance. The bet had transformed. It was no longer about humiliating Cartwright or conquering a woman. It was about proving to himself that he could find a key to a lock he didn't understand. It had become a personal obsession. He had to know the story that Seraphina Hayes refused to tell. Defeat was a foreign concept to Jax Blackwood. He had built his empire by adapting, by seeing angles others missed. His direct assaults on the fortress of Seraphina Hayes had failed spectacularly. His wealth was a liability, his charm was ineffective, and his power was irrelevant. He needed a new strategy, one that didn't involve the usual weapons in his arsenal. He had to stop trying to be Jackson Blackwood, the Cattle King, and start being someone else, or perhaps for the first time in a long time, just himself. He began by observing. From a high ridge overlooking her valley, a position known only to him from his youth, he would watch her through a spyglass. He saw her not as a prize, but as a person. He saw her mending fences with a skill that rivaled his own men. He saw her tending a small but vibrant garden behind the house, her movements gentle and precise. He saw her riding out at dawn, not on a delicate mare, but on a sturdy gelding, checking her small herd with a practiced eye. She was not a fragile flower wilting in her grief. She was a rancher, as tough and resilient as any man he knew. His opportunity came in the form of a late spring storm. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the heavens opened up with a fury that sent sheets of rain and hail lashing across the plains. The creek that snaked through her valley, normally so placid, swelled into a raging, muddy torrent. The next morning, Jax rode out not toward her house, but downstream. As he'd suspected, a section of her fence line along the creek had been completely washed away. A half-dozen of her cattle were already wandering out onto the open range at risk from predators and rustlers. He didn't ride to her door to offer help. Instead, he and Gus, along with 2 other trusted hands, spent the entire day in the muck and mud working tirelessly. They rounded up her stray cattle, drove them back to her pasture, and then began the back-breaking work of digging new post holes and stretching new wire. Jax worked alongside them, his expensive clothes stained with mud, his hands raw and blistered. He was no stranger to this work. It was how he'd started. Seraphina found them late in the afternoon. She rode up on her gelding, her face a mask of surprise. She sat on her horse for a long moment, simply watching the 4 men working in silence, their movements efficient and professional. Jax didn't stop or acknowledge her immediately. He finished tamping the dirt around a post, before finally looking up, wiping a smear of mud from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Fence was down," he said simply, his voice rough with fatigue. "Figured you could use a hand." She dismounted her eyes, scanning the new fence line, the neatly rounded-up cattle. There was no arrogance in his posture, no hint that this was another calculated ploy. There was only the quiet competence of a fellow rancher. "I didn't ask for your help, Mr. Blackwood," she said, but the ice in her tone had thawed, replaced by a grudging respect. "I know," he replied. "Neighborly thing to do, that's all." She looked at his hands, which were scraped and bleeding. She looked at his face, streaked with sweat and dirt. This was not the preening peacock from the saloon or the smooth suitor who had appeared at her fence. This was a man of the land. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. "You and your men, I would have lost those cattle." She paused. "Let me at least offer you something. Coffee. Supper." It was the invitation he'd wagered on, but it felt entirely different now. It wasn't a victory, it was an offering, a crack in the armor earned not with gold, but with sweat. "Coffee would be welcome," Jax said, nodding to his men to pack up their tools. Sitting on her porch, sipping the hot, strong coffee, she brewed an unfamiliar quiet settled between them. The grand porch, which had once seemed an extension of her defenses, now felt like neutral ground. "Why?" she asked, suddenly looking at him over the rim of her cup. "Why are you really doing this, Mr. Blackwood? The horses, the wine, and now this. It's not neighborly concern. A man like you doesn't do anything without a reason." Jax looked out at the valley, at the land she so clearly loved. He could lie. He could spin some tale of being captivated by her beauty or spirit. But he suspected she would see right through it. For the first time, he chose a dangerous path, the truth. Or at least a part of it. A man in a saloon made a foolish comment. He said, his voice low. He said you were unattainable, especially for a man like me. He let the implication of his mixed blood hang in the air. My pride got the better of me. I made a wager that I could earn an invitation into your home. He expected anger, outrage. He expected her to throw the hot coffee in his face and order him off her land forever. Instead, she was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, tinged with a weariness that seemed ancient. My life, she said, not looking at him. My home, my name, all just pieces in a game for men like you and Sterling Cartwright to play in a saloon. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact delivered with a profound sadness. Jax felt a hot flush of shame, a feeling so foreign it was disorienting. Seen through her eyes, his actions were not bold, but vulgar. The bet was not a show of strength, but a display of profound disrespect. Yes, he said the word tasting like ash in his mouth, and I am ashamed of it. His honesty seemed to surprise her. She turned to look at him, truly look at him, and for the first time he felt she was seeing past the legend, past the Comanche blood, and the mountains of gold to the man underneath. Shame is a powerful thing, Mr. Blackwood, she said softly. It can be a poison or it can be a seed. It depends entirely on what you do with it. She stood up. The coffee is finished. Your fence is mended. The debt is paid. It was a dismissal, but a gentle one. As he rode away, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley, Jax knew the dynamics had shifted irrevocably. He had won the invitation he sought, but the victory felt hollow. He had breached the outer walls of the fortress, but in doing so, he had come face to face with the woman inside, and he found himself wanting something more than to simply win a bet. He wanted to understand the source of her sadness, to earn her respect for real, and perhaps to plant a seed of his own. In the weeks that followed, a strange, unspoken truce settled between them. Jax made no more grand gestures. Instead, he would occasionally ride the perimeter where their lands met. Sometimes they would see each other in the distance and simply raise a hand in acknowledgement. Once he found her struggling to free a calf that had gotten stuck in a muddy bog. He worked with her in silence, their combined strength finally pulling the frightened animal free. They stood side by side, covered in mud, breathing heavily, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of sorrow, and it struck Jax with the force of a physical blow. He started to understand that her armor wasn't for him specifically. It was for the world. It was the necessary defense of a woman alone. A woman who had clearly known a deep pain that had nothing to do with him. The game had changed. The bet, which had once been his driving obsession, now felt like a vulgar secret he was keeping from her. The thought of Sterling Cartwright gloating of his men spying on her house to verify his tawdry victory filled him with a cold dread. One evening, as dusk was painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, he saw a lamp lit in her window. On an impulse, he didn't fully understand, he rode toward it. He wasn't sure what he would say or do, only that he felt drawn to the small beacon of light in the vast, darkening prairie. He found her on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the last of the light fade. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice calm. "You ride late." "Jax," he said quietly. "My name is Jax." She nodded slowly. "Seraphina." He dismounted and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in hand. The air was still and cool, fragrant with the scent of night-blooming flowers from her garden. "I came to tell you I'm calling off the bet," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "It was a dishonorable thing. What happens between us, if anything ever does, will not be for the amusement of fools in a saloon." I concede. Cartwright can have his money and his story. Seraphina looked at him for a long time, her hazel eyes searching his face in the twilight. She saw no deception, no clever tactic. She saw only a man wrestling with his own conscience. "And what do you think Sterling Cartwright will do with that story?" she asked softly. "He won't say you conceded out of honor. He will say the half-breed was rejected. He will say I sent you away because you were not good enough. He will use my name to humiliate you. Is that what you want?" He hadn't considered that. He had only thought of his own shame, not the position his concession would put her in. In their world, a woman's name was fragile, and Cartwright would delight in tarnishing hers to get at him. "No," he said, his voice tight. "That is not what I want." "Then the bet must be won," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She stood up and walked to the door, her hand resting on the handle. "Not for your pride, and not for the money. But so the story ends on our terms, so that a man like Sterling Cartwright holds no power over either of us." She turned the handle and pushed the door open, revealing the warm, lamplit interior of her home. "I am inviting you in for supper, Jax." He stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, the words of the wager echoing in his mind. "She will not only invite me into her home." He slowly climbed the steps and crossed the threshold. Her home was like her, simple, elegant, and strong. Polished wood floors, a large stone fireplace, shelves filled with books. It was a space of quiet comfort, a sanctuary. They ate a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, talking little. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had crossed a significant line. After they had cleared the plates, she led him into the sitting room. She gestured to a chair by the fire, but he remained standing. The tension was palpable. This was the moment of truth, the final part of the bet. He had won access to her home, but the rest, he found he could not bring himself to demand it or even expect it. "Serafina," he started, his voice rough. "You don't have to do this. I won't hold you to it." She turned from the fireplace, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. "I told you shame can be a seed," she said. "You have shown me you are not the man I first thought you were. And I am tired of being the untouchable widow. I am tired of my life being defined by a ghost." She closed the distance between them, her movements deliberate. She reached up and placed a hand on his cheek. Her touch was gentle, yet it sent a jolt through him that was more powerful than any passion he had ever known. "Stay," she whispered. "Not for a bet, not for victory. Stay for a woman who has not felt the comfort of another soul in this house for a very long time." It was a surrender, but not his victory. It was her own. A surrender to the possibility of a future, a choice to step out from behind her walls. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of conquest or triumph, but one of tenderness and a profound, aching vulnerability. It was an admission of a need he never knew he had. As he followed her up the stairs into the quiet darkness of her room, he knew his spies on the ridge would be noting the time. The bet was won. But as the door closed behind them, shutting out the world, Jax felt a sense of foreboding mixed with his desire. He had conquered the fortress, but he had a terrifying feeling that the real danger, the real secret, was locked inside. And he was about to be given the key. The first light of dawn crept through the lace curtains, painting pale stripes across the wooden floor. In the quiet intimacy of the bedroom, the world outside the bet, the spies on the ridge Sterling Cartwright felt 1,000,000 miles away. Jax lay on his back, watching the dust motes dance in the morning sunbeams, a feeling of profound peace settling over him. It was a peace he hadn't known was possible. Serafina stirred beside him, her breathing soft and even. She propped herself up on one elbow, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulder, her hazel eyes clear and serious in the morning light. The night had not been a feverish, passionate affair, but something deeper, quieter. It had been a sharing of solitude, a balm for two lonely souls. "It's almost dawn," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Your man and Cartwright's will have seen the lamp burn all night. You've won your bet, Jax." He turned to look at her, a knot tightening in his stomach. The mention of the bet felt like a sacrilege in this room at this moment. "It stopped being about the bet a long time ago." "I know," she said, "but it started there. And things that start in darkness often have a way of staying there. There's something you need to know. Something I couldn't tell you until I was sure. Until I could trust you." He sat up, the sense of peace evaporating, replaced by a cold premonition. He watched as she slipped out of bed, wrapped a silk robe around herself, and walked to a large, ornate cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She knelt and unlocked it with a small silver key she wore on a chain around her neck. From within, she didn't pull out letters or keepsakes. She retrieved a heavy leather-bound book, a business ledger. She carried it back to the bed and placed it between them. The leather was worn, the initials E.H. embossed in faded gold on the cover. Elias Hayes. "My husband was a meticulous man," she began, her voice steady but strained. "He recorded everything. Every cattle sale, every land purchase, every debt owed and paid. When he died, everyone told me what a great man he was. Honorable. Fair. The builder of this valley. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her late husband's precise, elegant script, columns of figures, dates, and names. After the grief subsided, she continued, I was left with questions. Elias was a closed man. There was a part of him he never shared. I started going through his papers, trying to understand the man I had been married to, and I found this. She flipped through the pages, her finger tracing a line of entries from nearly 20 years ago. He was in partnership back then, a man with a vision as big as his own. They were buying up land, building a herd. They were on the verge of creating the biggest cattle empire this territory had ever seen. She stopped on a page, her finger resting on a name. Jax leaned closer to read it. Thomas Blackwood. The name hit him like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwood was his father, a man he barely remembered, a ghost from his childhood. His father had been a rancher, a dreamer who had lost everything: his land, his money, his life, in what Jax had always been told was a series of disastrous business deals and a final brutal Indian raid. It was that ruin that had sent his mother back to her people and him on a path of relentless, vengeful ambition. My father, Jax whispered, his voice hoarse. They were partners. Serafina confirmed, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful pity. According to these entries, your father secured a massive loan from a bank in St. Louis, using his entire landholding as collateral. The money was to be used to buy a huge tract of land from the railroad. Her finger moved down the page to a series of withdrawals and transfers. But the land was never purchased. The money vanished. According to Elias's notes here, there was a falling out. He claims Thomas took the money and fled. A month later, the bank foreclosed on your father's land. Elias, being the junior partner, but having some capital of his own, was able to buy it for pennies on the dollar at the auction. Jack stared at the page, his mind reeling. My father was no thief. He was an honest man. I know, Serafina said softly. She turned a few more pages to a section at the very back of the ledger where the entries were different, less precise, more hurried, as if written under great stress. This is what I found months later, she said. It seems to be a private record, a confession of a sort. She pointed to an entry dated 6 months after his father's supposed ruin. Jax read the words and the air left his lungs. The world tilted on its axis. The Blackwood matter is settled. Cartwright's men confirm Thomas will not be a problem. The raid was a success. Looks authentic. The Comanche will be blamed. His boy is gone with the mother's people. A loose end, but a distant one. I have paid Sterling's father handsomely for the service. The land is mine. All of it. The foundation is secure. Jax read it again, and then a third time. The neat, elegant script seemed to mock him, to scream at him from the page. It wasn't a bad business deal. It wasn't a random Indian raid. It was a conspiracy, a cold-blooded, calculated betrayal. Elias Hayes, the respected rancher, had fabricated the story of the theft. He had stolen the loan money himself. Then, to cover his tracks and eliminate his partner, he had hired Sterling Cartwright's father, a man known for his ruthlessness, and his gang of hired guns to stage a fake Comanche raid. They had murdered his father and made it look like the work of his mother's people, a truly diabolical twist of the knife. And Elias Hayes had built his entire fortune, his beautiful home, this last serenity, on the foundation of that bloody lie. Jax Blackwood froze. He wasn't just cold, he was ice from the inside out. The very ground beneath him, the empire he had built, in a furious effort to reclaim what his father had lost, was all a reaction to a fiction. His entire life had been a quest for vengeance against a phantom. The real villain was the sainted man, whose house he was in, whose wife was beside him. And the smirking fool he'd made the bet with Sterling Cartwright wasn't just a rival. He was the son of his father's murderer. The bet, the woman, the house. He hadn't conquered anything. He had been led step by step into the very heart of his own stolen history. He looked at Serafina, and for the first time, he understood the source of her profound sadness, the reason for her impenetrable armor. She hadn't been grieving a husband. She had been living with the ghost of a monster. He had come here on a bet to possess a widow, and she had just revealed a truth that dispossessed him of his own past, his own identity, and his own sanity. Jax left the last serenity as the sun crested the hills, but he felt no warmth. He rode not with the swagger of a victorious man, but with the rigid, unnerving stillness of a ghost. The ledger was tucked securely in his saddlebag, its weight feeling heavier than gold. Gus met him a mile from the ranch, a look of tired relief on his face. "You did it, boss," the foreman said with a weary grin. "I'll be damned. You were in there all night." Cartwright's man saw it too. He rode off like a bat out of hell to tell Sterling. Jax just stared through him, his blue eyes looking like chips of ice. "Get the men, Gus, all of them. Tell them to arm themselves and meet me in Redemption Gulch. And you, I want you to stick close." Gus's smile faded, replaced by concern. He'd seen Jax angry, he'd seen him ruthless, but he'd never seen him like this. This was a cold, quiet fury that was far more terrifying than any loud explosion. "What is it, Jax? What happened in there?" "The world changed." Jax said, his voice flat. He spurred his horse and rode toward the town, leaving his confused foreman in a cloud of dust. By the time Jax arrived, the news of his victory had already saturated Redemption Gulch. Sterling Cartwright was holding court in the Grand Saloon, just as he had been the night the bet was made. He was buying rounds for the house, his booming laughter echoing out into the street. To Jackson Blackwood. Cartwright toasted, raising his glass as Jax stepped through the saloon doors. The man who proved that even the iciest fortress can be thawed by a persistent suitor. Come, Blackwood, collect your winnings. $5,000 as promised. He gestured to a heavy canvas bag sitting on the table. The patrons of the saloon cheered and stomped their feet. It was a spectacle. Jax's triumph, and in a way, his humiliation, laid bare for all to see. Jax walked slowly toward the table, his spurs ringing out in the sudden silence that fell as the crowd sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He ignored the bag of money, his gaze fixed solely on Cartwright. "I didn't come for the money, Sterling," Jax said, his voice dangerously calm. Cartwright's grin faltered. "What's this, a sudden bout of chivalry? Don't tell me the Ice Queen melted your savage heart." Jax stopped at the edge of the table. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the ledger, tossing it down with a heavy thud. It fell open on the polished wood. "I came for a debt of blood," Jax said. He tapped the open page with his finger. "Does the name Thomas Blackwood mean anything to you? Sterling." Cartwright paled slightly, his eyes flicking from the ledger to Jax's face. "Never heard of him. Some old business of yours?" "No." Jax replied, his voice dropping lower, cutting through the murmurs of the room. "It was old business of my father's. And yours." He looked around the room at the curious faces, the miners, the ranchers, the drifters. "All of you think you know me. The rich half-breed who built an empire from nothing. You're wrong. My father built the foundation of that empire, he and his partner, Elias Hayes. A gasp went through the room. They were poised to own this entire territory. Jax continued, his voice ringing with a cold, hard clarity. Until my father was betrayed, robbed by his partner and then murdered to cover the crime. He pointed a finger directly at Cartwright. Murdered by your father Sterling. Hired by Elias Hayes to stage a fake Comanche raid to kill my father and make it look like the work of my mother's people. The accusation was so monstrous, so shocking that the entire saloon was struck dumb. Cartwright leaped to his feet, his face a mask of fury and fear. "That's a lie, a slanderous, insane lie," he sputtered. "You have no proof. It's all in here," Jax said, tapping the ledger again. Elias Hayes's own hand, confessing to the whole rotten scheme. How he stole the money, how he bought my father's land for nothing, and how he paid your father for his service. Jax's men, led by Gus, had filtered into the saloon, now taking up positions by the doors and walls. They weren't there to start a fight, but to finish one. "My father," Sterling stammered, backing away. "He was a respectable man. Your father was a paid butcher." Jax roared, the cold calm finally breaking, replaced by a wave of raw volcanic rage. "And you've been living off his blood money your entire life, your ranch, your wealth. It's all built on the bones of my family. You sneered at my blood, but your own is stained with murder and theft." He strode around the table, backing Cartwright against the bar. "This bet wasn't about a woman. It was fate. It was the ghost of my father leading me to the truth. You wanted to humiliate me over $5,000. Your family owes me everything." Sheriff Brody, a man known to be in Cartwright's pocket, finally found his courage. "Now hold on, Jax," he said, placing a hand on his pistol. "Them are some serious accusations." Gus cocked the hammer on his Colt, the sound echoing like a death knell in the silent room. "I'd take your hand off that weapon, Sheriff," Gus said calmly. "This is Blackwood business now." Jax ignored them. He stared into Cartwright's terrified eyes. "You're going to sell your ranch, Sterling. All of it. And the proceeds are going to be placed in a fund for the families of the Comanche who were hunted and killed in the years after that raid, when the territory went mad for revenge over a crime they didn't commit. It was a brilliant, devastating move. Not just vengeance, but justice. A way to redeem not only his father's name, but his mother's people. "You can't," Cartwright whimpered. "I can," Jax said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Or I can hand this ledger to the territorial marshals. Elias Hayes is dead, but you, as the beneficiary of his crime, and your father's son will be ruined. You'll be hanged for his sins. Your choice, poverty or the rope." Sterling Cartwright, the proud, arrogant rancher, collapsed against the bar, a broken man. The story was over. The truth was out. The reckoning had come to Redemption Gulch, not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the quiet, damning testimony of a dead man's pen. Jax turned and walked away from the sobbing man, leaving the bag of gold untouched on the table. The bet was a forgotten ghost, a prelude to a story so much larger and more terrible than he could have ever imagined. He stepped out of the saloon into the bright sunlight, a man unmade and remade in the space of a single night. He had found the truth, but the truth had cost him his rage, the very fuel that had driven him his entire life. He was free, but he was also adrift. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Sterling Cartwright, stripped of his wealth, and his name vanished from the territory within a week, a spectre of a man fleeing the ghosts he had inherited. The ledger was made public, its contents read aloud on the steps of the courthouse. The name of Elias Hayes was transformed overnight from that of a revered pioneer to a reviled villain. The town of Redemption Gulch was forced to look at its own history, a history built on a bloody and duplicitous secret. Jax Blackwood, however, didn't revel in his victory. The fire of vengeance that had burned in him for so long had been extinguished, leaving behind a cold, empty hearth. He had righted the past, but he had no map for the future. His identity as the wronged son seeking retribution was gone, and he felt like a stranger in his own skin. He found himself riding not over his own vast lands, but toward the valley of the last serenity. The name itself was now an irony steeped in blood. He found Serafina not in the house, but in the small private cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. It was a simple plot with only one headstone. She was standing before the grave of Elias Hayes, her expression unreadable. She had a shovel in her hand. "I wondered when you would come," she said without turning around. "What are you doing?" Jax asked, his voice quiet. "I am an accomplice," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I lived in his house. I ate his food. I wore the clothes he bought with blood money. I slept in his bed. I may not have known the truth, but I benefited from the lie. His name does not deserve to mark this land." She looked at him then, and he saw the immense burden she carried. She was the keeper of the monster's legacy. "That wasn't your sin, Serafina," he said gently. "You brought the truth to light." "And what good is a truth that destroys everything?" she asked, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "This valley, this home, it is all tainted. I cannot stay here." He walked to her and gently took the shovel from her hands. "A foundation can be rebuilt," he said. "The land isn't guilty. The house isn't guilty. We are what we choose to be now, not what our pasts were." He looked from the headstone to the vast, beautiful valley, and then to his own sprawling empire just over the horizon. He saw it all differently now, not as conquests, but as legacies. One built on a lie, the other built on a thirst for vengeance against that lie. Both tainted. "What you did," he said, turning to face her fully, "took a courage I can't even fathom. You held the secret that could have protected your comfortable life, your name, your home. But you chose to give it to me, knowing it would shatter everything. You chose truth over comfort. That is a foundation worth building on." An idea clean and clear formed in his mind. It wasn't born of passion or romance, but something stronger, a shared understanding, a common ground forged in the ruins of their respective pasts. "Your ranch is built on my father's stolen dreams," he said. "My ranch was built to avenge him. Neither is clean. Let's make them clean. Together." She looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you saying? I'm not talking about marriage or some grand romance," he said, his voice earnest. "I'm talking about a partnership, the partnership my father was robbed of. We join our lands. We tear down the fences between them. We manage it together. We take the name Blackwood and the name Hayes, and we wash them clean with honesty and hard work. We build something new, something that honors the truth, not the lies." He gestured to the headstone. "We can remove this. We can start over. Not as the rich Comanche and the widow, but as two people who were handed a terrible legacy and chose to make something good from it." Serafina looked at him, at his piercing blue eyes that were no longer cold, but filled with a quiet, steady purpose. She saw a path forward, not one that erased the past, but one that redeemed it. It was not a promise of happiness, but a promise of purpose. A chance to create a new story, their own story, not one, written for them by the ghosts of dead men. She nodded slowly, a faint, real smile touching her lips. a new foundation," she whispered. Together they turned their backs on the grave and walked toward the house, the valley stretching out before them under a vast open sky. The bet was a distant memory, a foolish spark that had ignited a cleansing fire. What lay ahead was uncertain and would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time for both of them, it felt like a dawn. A new dawn on the prairie, full of pain and possibility, a chance not just for serenity, but for true redemption. And so, a story that began with a cynical bet in a smoky saloon ended with the promise of a new beginning forged in the crucible of a devastating truth. The tale of Jax Blackwood and Seraphina Hayes reminds us that the past is never truly buried, and that our greatest battles are often fought not against our enemies, but against the lies we believe about ourselves. It's a story of pride vengeance, and the quiet courage it takes to choose a difficult truth over a comfortable lie. They didn't find a simple happy ending. They found something far more real and valuable, a shared purpose, and a chance at redemption. If this story of the untamed West, of its hidden sins and unexpected salvation, resonated with you, show your support. Hit that like button to let us know these tales matter. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story with depth and consequence, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories from the dusty trails of history to share, each one a testament to the enduring complexities of the human heart. Thank you for listening.